Thank you very much for this interesting lecture. I'm sure that these most interesting and original papers will evoke an animated discussion, but first I would like to ask both of you. 70 years after the war, we may have an impression that art, film, poetry said everything about the war. But on the other hand, it is not true. On my field of historical research, we know very little about sexual violence against Polish women. This topic is well developed in Germany, but not in Poland. Also on the set of literature and film. To the best of my knowledge, in Poland is only one novel. I mean a novel by Kinga Iwasiów, and one movie called Róża. My question is, are there any issues that were not mentioned by art? Are there unnamed, unspoken fields?
It's a very sensitive remark, because as Martin Polak mentioned yesterday, there are many subjects which are steered out from the level of discussion. And only 70 years after, the discussion is coming back to the secret sides of the war, unspoken, like the subject of the rapes, which are really shown the first time in the movie Róża. I didn't quote it in my lecture because I wanted to be very brief. So it opens the special discussion. Also, all the rapes made on the German territory, which was also mentioned yesterday, still didn't pave the way to the art. And I think it's the field to be fulfilled slowly by the next generations. There was some mentioning about it in also in other books made by Polish authors, not only Kinga Iwasiów, not straightforward, but and this is one of many. The other subject, which is not still shown up, is a pecking order in the extermination camp, except of the novels of Borowski. It's never mentioned by anybody, by any survivor, what they did to survive, which was their position in this line of pecking order. Because if you were at the end, you would never survive. So this inner life, the structure of power inside of the barrack is still something which is hidden. And I don't know whether anybody could talk about it later on. There are some memoirs, especially printed or published recently, that you can guess what was going on. But the price for survival is still not pointed. So there are two very important subjects which are still not really known, especially not only in art, but as a fact sheet.
No, I completely agree with you. In my experience, rape remains one of the taboo subjects in all representations of all wars. It's something I discuss with my students. Kate Kolovitz in the beginning of the century is one very rare example. Peter Hausen, who's a Scottish artist in the Bosnian context, created an absolute furore in an exhibition he had in London showing a violent rape in Bosnia. It was actually edited out of the exhibition, so it remains one of the most deeply problematic, repressed of subjects in wider context, which is not to say it should not be confronted. What I was also going to say, though, of course, artists they're not historians. They don't work to order. A historian can say, yes, there are gaps in our knowledge, we must seek to address them. Artists don't work in quite as systematic a way.
Yeah, I just, one more remark. Of course, when you look to the body of work of Alina Shapochnikov, you can see the very tight links between sex and death. But she would never, ever say a single word about it. It's visible in her art, so you can only guess what could have she passed over between the 13 and 18 years old when she started. She was 13 years old. When the war ended, she was 18. So this was the period when you grow up, also sexually. So to spend this period in ghettos and concentration camps and the death camps, you should experience something more than you tell.
Now I open the discussion.
Ich werde meine Frage auf Deutsch stellen. Ich habe eigentlich zwei Fragen. Erste bezieht sich an diese Themen, die gerade angesprochen wurden. Müssen alle Tabus gebrochen werden? Müssen alle Themen angesprochen werden? Ist das wirklich notwendig, um bestimmte Themenbereiche zu rezipieren? Muss alles gesagt werden, auch in Kunst. Und die andere Frage, ganz andere Frage, ich würde gerne wissen, ob es irgendwelche Beispiele gibt, wo sich die Behörden, die Staatsbehörden, die Bezirksbehörden irgendwie mit der Geschichte und Kunstgeschichte so befassen oder befasst haben, dass man zum Beispiel irgendwelche Formen von der Kunstaktivitäten in Stadtbereichen bringen mochte, in dieser Weise, dass man dadurch auch etwas erzählen wollte über die Geschichte. Ich weiß nicht, ob das verständlich war, was ich fragen wollte, aber hoffentlich. Ja, danke.
Are you talking about now, in the present? Yes, yeah. I'm not sure if this goes perhaps beyond our domain a little bit. Can I go back to your first point, which I think is an interesting one? I assume from your question that you think maybe there are some things that are better not exposed. Am I right or not? I mean, I personally think everything is raw material for artists, but it is the way that it's dealt with which is important and needs to be criticized and thought about critically.
Yeah, the subject of the science is to learn and to reveal the truth. The role of the artist is to take it into consideration or not.
Thank you very much for...
Yes, about the
Go.
I mean, I'm not quite sure what sort of schemes you have in mind, but for example, I think yesterday reference was made to the Jewish Cultural Festival in Krakow, which is an example, yes, of a city deciding that it must do something collectively, as it were, and that certainly includes art exhibitions and concerts and many other things besides. There's an exhibition that was recently in Dresden and then coming, I think, shortly to Poland, again on contemporary Jewish European identity, where, of course, once more, not always, but the Holocaust is central. So, you know, these are recent and current examples, at least, of collective, you know, enterprises. Yeah.
Can I? Well, it is not that simple, but there is a process in Poland. I cannot talk about on behalf of the whole world, but in Poland there is a constant process of unveiling the reality from the past. And it goes simultaneously, not in the big centers, and not in the form of big exhibitions, but as a everyday activity. And it depends on the individual who is a spiritus movens. I know two examples. One in the northeast part of Poland, which is a sort of a Belarusian minority living on the Polish side, where there were two people. First, it was Sokrat Janowicz, the Belarusian language poet, and Leon Tarasewicz, who is the Belarusian origin Polish artist and painter, who are digging the history of their neighborhood and opening the unseen side, not only about the Belarusian identity and Russian Orthodox identity of many of citizens, but also the others. I don't mention Polish, which is the majority always, but also the Jews and Germans. The same is done by Miroslav Balka, another artist, in the city of Otwock, when he digged out many sides of the location and is bringing back the identity of that location. So it goes on, not obviously in a close connection with Holocaust, but sooner or later they come to that point, as in both cities like Krynki and Otwock. The majority of citizens were of Jewish origins, who evaporated from that place later on and were covered with a silence for many, 50 years. So this is it.
I'm also aware there's, I think, is it Horst Hoheisel in Germany, who is the kind of initiator of a project where research is done into the former Jewish inhabitants of particular houses, and small memorial stones are placed often in the presence of surviving descendants of the family. So as you say, these are small-scale, quite intimate gestures, perhaps more meaningful in the end than the more grand public ones. Yeah.
Yes, you mentioned in your presentation the Richter painting Aunt Marianne, and it's only relatively recently that we know that Aunt Marianne perished in the euthanasia killings. And this also sort of strikes on an issue which for a long time has been tabooized also in the families, that there were actually members of the family who were murdered as mentally deranged people or as handicapped people, which was a sort of family stigma which was carried on in the family even to these days. And it's the third generation only which starts to excavate these issues among families. It's something I just wanted to add.
Yeah, that's a very strange situation, because in the mid of 60s, Richter had this manner of painting after the photographs. So he took the family album and subconsciously, I mean, without the conscious, he made several paintings based on this album. And it occurred that there were both victims and perpetrators in his family. So Uncle Rudi, the brother of his mother, in the uniform, in Wehrmacht uniform, was one of the portraits. But Tante Marianne Schonfelder was a sister of Uncle Rudi and his mother, who was first sterilized in the sterilization program by force. And then at the end of the war, before the end of the war, was killed in another program, that's euthanasia program. And Richter didn't know it. He just made that portrait and learned the truth only later on. And the same concern with the family Amer, when he portraited his father-in-law, who occurred to be a doctor sterilizing people in the process of sterilization. So in one family you have both. So this is the interesting side of it, except of Uncle Rudi, that he realized, and he had to elaborate this, his attitude toward his uncle. And it's a very interesting story, by the way, because Uncle Rudi is now in the collection of the museum in Lidice, given by Richter in a group of 21 paintings on art pieces collected by René Bloch in 1967 and given to the city of Lidice. But the process of delivering was as long that it was 68 and the Czech authorities didn't want it. So René Bloch kept it for another 10 years or longer. And then again another 10 people, 10 artists of Germany added their gifts. And now the body of works of 31 German artists are located in the museum in Lidice. And this is a special phenomenon, because only one painting, the one of Richter, is really made on the subject. The others are the gesture of gift. And they don't have a subject of neither of Lidice nor of the German Guild, nothing in common with the war, just a gesture. And this is the one which is interesting. And the other is that Lidice are the only spot, the only city that the German artists are sort of making a bow to. We know it's a victim of the persecution of the Nazi forces, but there were much more. I don't mention Babi Yar, right, for example, but also Warsaw was a victim of the Nazi special treatment. 200,000 people of civil inhabitants were killed in 1944 during the Warsaw Uprising. And nobody decided to say, well, they deserve something, the city of Warsaw deserves something from our side, which is very interesting from the psychological, social psychology point of view. Sorry, it was just a footnote.
Can I just interject something that's sort of not directly relevant, but I think relevant? When you were talking about the donation of works, most of which did not bear direct connection with what happened at Lidice, I'm reminded of the Museum of Contemporary Art in Hiroshima, where Magdalena Abakanowicz, who we both admire greatly, has works which I think she in turn donated. There too, I think I'm right in saying, although I haven't been, there are many artworks spanning quite a few centuries, a few decades, very few of which directly grapple with the implication of the dropping of the bomb. So I think there's some quite interesting things to think about there.
Next questions?
Thank you very much for two fascinating papers. I want to bring the discussion back to the theme of the conference in a way, and to ask you a bit more about the public reaction to the art that you've been describing, whether it's films or whether it's pictures and images. what the function of art is in terms of remembrance. Were many of these artists self-consciously involved in a process of remembering for a wider public, or is this something which is important to them? I wonder if you could say a bit more about the public reaction. Thank you.
Shall I start? Okay. Answering the first bit first, I think artists very rarely, unless of course they are given a public commission where the very debates and controversies surrounding the project are part of the meaning of the project, as James Young has very persuasively argued. But if it is an artist working for him or herself in the first instance, the primary impulse is to express your own relationship to that past. And I would suggest that the most eloquent of such works are precisely those which are rooted in extreme subjectivity, yes? However, whatever shape that takes, but thereby have a message, a wider sort of message for a wider public. They're not official spokesmen, let's put it that way, for formulating public memory, but I think they have, and that takes me back to what I was saying at the beginning, that usually art is rather overlooked as rich in potential for discussion. I mean, getting, never mind adults, school children, to look at works of art, ideally in the original, in the gallery, can provoke some very, rich conversations and debates and discussions about the meaning of history in the present. I think that's the important thing.
Yeah, I think each artist believes in his message. So he believes when he delivers a message, it goes further on and is somehow comprehended by the society, larger or narrower, or sooner or later. It took, Andrzej Wawrecki died in 1957. So he's still not well recognized out of Poland, but it's now the process of recognition is going on. So sometimes you need more than half a century to be recognized and to deliver your message, which was, he made it this painting when he was 21. So, this is a special story. Alina Shapochnikov has been recognized only recently after her chain of exhibition in the USA and Europe.
But under that presupposes that an artist has a message which is somehow monolithic or easily apprehended, and of course that's not necessarily the case. I mean, Wroblewski, it's very ambiguous work, and I think it's precisely the ambiguities, the tensions, the unspoken, the complexities of how they're conveying their message that are interesting, and of course also the controversies, even the scandals that accompany the public reaction to such work become part of the significance of it.
Yeah, in case of Uklański or Libera, for example.
Yeah, may I ask, thank you for very interesting presentation, but I ask myself if, maybe I formulate this a bit provocative, if really the picture, image of the Second World War in the piece of arts are so one-sided. One-sided.
One-sided?
Yeah, because, for many nations in Europe, also Soviet occupation and the so-called liberation afterwards it's the experience of the Second World War. Many of these artists and intellectuals became communists after the war. Wróblewski, Wajda, Kruczkowski, and
Wajda
so on.
was never communist.
But his film were Pokolenie was very, even.
It's a very easy judgment.
It's a easy. No, yeah, of course. But you agree with Borowski if we're now talking about formal joining the Communist Party. So for many now we know the new picture of the also by historians is also to think about this both totalitarian regime together. And you show no piece of work, piece of arts which reflects this side of the war experience. My second remark is concerning you show in your paper presentation that the most I think we have two kinds of artists here show as one smaller group. There are Austrian, German, who in a way are successor on their family perpetrators, sometimes victims. On the other hand, there are many Jewish artists, and this is of course probably connected with the questions of the collective identity, new Jewish identity, and so on. But there are many. I remember one of the last my talk with Scheiner, and he, in some sense, he was very frustrated with the fact when he met a German audience, he was always asked if he is Jewish. He was not Jewish, as far as we know. But it is also a kind of, the questions of this broad, different experiences of the Second World War are not reduced on one, of course, most awful crime in the Second World War. This would be my questions. How is it actually? This is in the art, depicted in the art. Yeah.
Can you?
The third remarks, because the way in which we represent it, I would say, in a way, we expect it all from the artists to be courageous, to break with taboo. But these pieces of you show, these examples of the work actually show us the current, I would say, main interpretation, current main narrative of the Second World War. And there's something really new also in European discussion after, the experience, let's say, Baltic states and small nation of Eastern Europe. It's much more included in the collective memory of Europeans. Thank you.
I understand your lecture, but I didn't understand your questions. Can you make your question clear?
Yeah, once again,
Don't say what we, just put the question.
Yeah, the question is it really this kind of, the other experiences, different experience of the Second World War? For instance, experiences with the Soviet occupation, with the so-called Soviet liberation, are they now expressed in the work of arts? Are these, let's say, Latvian, Lithuanian, Estonian, Polish, Romanians, artists who, yeah? Because you didn't show any examples.
No, it's a reasonable question. I mean, I made it clear from the start that I could have ranged a little bit more widely in terms of what the Second World War meant, but in my experience, it is the Holocaust which is the overwhelmingly central phenomenon, if I can use that word. In answer to your question, I don't know. It may be that indeed there are artists working in those areas of Europe, and maybe you do know better than I. If there are, and if I don't know about them, that also says something, because their work has not been shown broadly enough for somebody like me to be aware of it. Does anybody else have an answer to those questions? I mean, for example, if you look at Soviet art, my knowledge is much more minimal, but if you look at representations of the Second World War in post-war Soviet art, it's still essentially of a social, heroic mold, exactly, which is not what we're talking about. But Anda, do you have anything more to add?
Many years ago, something like in '98, I made an exhibition of Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, of non-official art from that states. And to my amazement, there was not a single piece about the Russian occupation in that territories. First. Then, of course, I could have included some examples, mainly of movies and literature, because to my knowledge, there is not a single really serious art piece about the Soviet influence, Soviet occupation, Polish territory. Therefore, I couldn't quote it. I listed only few out of hundreds who were active, not only in Poland, but I had half an hour, and each of the artists deserved the full lecture. and you may lecturing the whole year the same subject. So I had to be brief. And I wanted to show different positions and different attitudes from generation to generation. And the artists I mentioned were mostly of non-Jewish origins, which is pretty important. And they were not only working on the subject of Holocaust. This is what I thought was pretty clear in my presentation. So I thought, when I mentioned Andrzej Wajda, Józef Szajna, Miroslav Balka, Sasnal, Libera, and so on, they are all non-Jewish origin people. So this is, which is, in my opinion, important and which differ the Polish art maybe from many other countries, that the Polish artists are looking to the war in a very specific way, including Władysław Strzemiński, who was a victim of the First World War already.
Well, I would like to remind you of the visual art on stage. And in Poland, of course, we have not only Szajna, but we had Grotowski and we had Tadeusz Kantor. And it is a very strong visualization of these memories and impressions. It's very important. That's one thing I want to tell you. Another thing, there are some painters in Eastern Germany who have been members of the Wehrmacht soldiers. Zitter was the most prominent example, who tried to digest what they had seen and what they had gone through. And one more suggestion to read again, What a Beautiful Sunday, by Jorge Semprún, because it tells something about the techniques and also the guilt of survival in Buchenwald. He wrote The Big Journey, his travel from Compiègne to Buchenwald 4.5 days. He wrote it only 12 years after his liberation, but later he wrote this other book, Oh, What a Wonderful Sunday, and it's a portrait of the Buchenwald camp and the structures who were able to survive through some communist networks within the camp.
Thank you very much.
To keep it brief, but if what I say doesn't make sense, I'll be happy to expand. My question is inspired by the images that Professor Baum-Duchen showed of Judy Chicago. Because what struck me very forcefully about those images, I don't know if it's easy to bring them up again, is how much, for me anyway, they evoke the mural art of the 1930s, of the Works Progress administration. But it was an international style.
Yeah,
and it was a style that was intrinsically bound up with politics, with certain idealistic, internationalist notions of human progress. So in this light, I actually think it's quite interesting, an interesting choice by Chicago to portray the Holocaust and genocide using this style from the period that immediately preceded those events. Two thoughts that follow from that. I said I'd be brief, but obviously I'm not going to. One is, it's quite a contrast with the visual style of almost all the rest of the art that you showed, which is somber and dark and restrained. So I'm interested in that contrast. Second, the fact that many of the artists who, including writers, who first attempted to represent the Holocaust also came out of this political tradition. I'm thinking in my own work about a woman like Halina Krahelska, a Polish writer, who wrote the first publication about the death camp at Auschwitz, or about the concentration camp at Auschwitz.
Not the first.
1942.
Oh.
At least Bartoszewski says it was the first.
Yeah.
So,
Underground.
should we be embarrassed by overtly political, engaged representations? That's the first question. The second question is, why do we need to know which artists are Jewish and which ones have connections with the Holocaust? Thank you.
Okay, several interesting questions there. May I answer the one about Judy Chicago specifically? In a way, it goes back to the question of messages. you're quite right, her work does stand apart. It has a didactic, I think an openly didactic, I was going to say messianic, it's not quite the right word, but there is a message about the universality, the need to bring together different forms of human suffering that marks it out from the others. And you're quite right, I think, to make the connections to that more innocent, more overtly politicized 1930s mural tradition. I find, in the context of the other possible responses, that it is rather crude and oversimplifying in its impulses. You may disagree, perhaps we can talk about it later.
Yes, for me it wasn't important who is of Jewish origin, who is not, but I was provoked by the question. Was not the question I rose up.
I suspect it does make a difference. You're right, one needn't necessarily declare it. But for example, the reconstruction, the bus terminus, yeah. I mean, this is a young British artist, non-Jewish, no personal, never mind Jewish, but to my knowledge, no personal connection. And I think there is a kind of detachment that is more possible, perhaps, yes, if you are unconnected.
Yeah, may I add that, as a matter of fact, we all this is our common heritage. We cannot escape from that, whoever we are, here in Europe especially. After 1945, we share that trauma.
Jacqueline Boysen, I'm not specialized in arts, not at all, but I want to get to know something about art is not only creating, but also it comes to living, let's say, by the recipients of art, by the audience. I would like to know whether you can tell us something about the reaction of the survivors on these artworks, the modern artworks, let's say, of younger people, of non-survivors, of those who just apparently are, wanted to provoke or use the history we all have in our minds to tell another story. I mean, their idea in the first place was not creating on the survivors didn't want to create artwork. They first of all wanted to, let's say, lighten their it was psychological impetus they had, or they wanted to do documentary. They wanted to show what happened in their pieces of art, which were not meant to be pieces of art in the first place. And how do they react on things like this?
That's not entirely true. I have to say that even the work done at the time, its status is very equivocal. And if you read the post-war statements of the survivor artists, it's quite clear that actually the aesthetic impulse, odd as it may sound, was actually rather important. It's a big subject. Do you want to talk about,
Well, I don't think the survivors are the special group of people. They represent somehow in the attitude towards art, the whole society. So it's each person is looking to the art from the different perspective and is understanding it in a different way.
It is an important question, though, if I may just quickly. This work, I think I mentioned, it was exhibited alongside the even more controversial work of Libera and Juklansky, the two Polish artists, talked about, at for the Western world anyway, a really rather important exhibition that was held at the Jewish Museum in New York in 2002 called Mirroring Evil, Nazi Imagery and Contemporary Art. And I actually have, I could prove it to you, but I won't. I have another slide which shows it's a photograph of a demonstration of Holocaust survivors outside the museum saying, how dare you, this trivializes the Holocaust. So you can understand why, but as Anders says, these are topics, this is a legacy we all have to deal with, albeit in very different ways, and these artists have a right, however controversial and problematic it might be, to deal with the subject in their own way. Yeah.
Okay, Dr. Bohm, could you go back to the picture of this Jerome Witkin,
Yes.
this what you called Holocaust kitsch? Because in the middle there is a white clad, who is the Jew in the picture.
Yeah.
And who is this white-clad person in the center?
I was hoping nobody would ask, because I'm not actually quite sure. I don't know if anybody has any ideas. It looks like I mean, is it meant to be a rough? I'm actually not sure. I mean, I assume, I mean, a Jew in the ruin, I assume is the screaming head buried in the rubble. It's a clerical figure of some sort. I wondered whether it's a Christian clerical figure or possibly a rabbi on the Day of Atonement. You wear white. I'm not sure. I think it... I don't think so, but yeah. So you're right, it's not entirely straightforward, but nevertheless, I think the kind of lack of subtlety in the handling of the forms is verges on kitsch. I mean, I'm not pronouncing judgment necessarily, but it's something to think about.
Two last question, because the coffee is ready.
I think it belongs, in a way, to something which is called the Holocaust industry, very dangerous, I say, production, so to say, and against which Libera made his leg Auschwitz again.
Thank you very much for two interesting presentations. What I picked up on is the development and trend in portraying and interpreting Second World War and images of the Holocaust from, let's say, a subjective perspective to very objective perspective, completely abstract notion and detachment to the overall event, not just because of a personal relation, being Jewish, not Jewish, but also because of time. And I think what is happening in art is also happening in studying the Holocaust, or studying that particular period as we are losing witnesses and generations are moving on. So I'm wondering whether there is two things, whether there is a discussion, critical discussions among artists, to what extent the sort of detached abstract portrayal of a distant event and the responsibility there, is it a realization on the part of the artist in the process of art creating? And that's one thing. And second thing, how should we, from a contemporary point of view and our eyes, look at such art? How should we understand that? You know, the trend developing from very subjective, one could say like diary of a former prisoner in a concentration camp that later appears somewhere on exhibition, all the way to something like this. So I'm wondering how shall we understand that as a trend and learn from that?
Well, I don't think it's a trend. There are some artists who are focused on that subject and working on it, and there are some which are not. That's it. So there is not a sort of imposed discussion and a must from the society or from the art milieu. No, it's like the rest of art. Everybody is doing what he feels he needs.
No, but I think there is some truth in what you're saying, which was kind of implicit in certainly my selection of images. But there are exceptions, and I deliberately dwell on this. I mean, you can't get more subjective, yes, than a work like this, which is done in 2004. But you are right, I think, in principle, that generally speaking, there is a almost organic kind of evolution or transformation of approaches whereby a younger generation has no direct access, even if they are the children of those implicated directly, and where indeed the main focus of their work is precisely on the impossibility of full understanding and of direct access, and hence I think that question, for example, of the blurring of the image is a kind of symptom perhaps of that acknowledgement.
But I just read in the press that there's going to be open the exhibition about the attitude towards Auschwitz, not the full Holocaust, by the artists from 3 states, Poland, Germany, and Israel, to be shown in the museum in Krakow, Museum of Contemporary Art in Krakow. I'm curious how it is now shown by the youngest generation.
The last question.
I would just like to add that from our experience teaching with art or encouraging and training teachers who are not necessarily art teachers, but rather history teachers, literature teachers, and others who would like to teach about this subject, from our experience using art from Felix Nussbaum, from Karol Deutsch, from even Tokolchev, who again liberates Auschwitz on the 27th of January. That art, which again is like documentation of their own experience, which is also their confrontations with what is happening at the time, has been very effective. And in fact, we've even developed a video toolbox, which is available via Yad Vashem's website, in order to encourage teachers, again, in an interdisciplinary fashion, to use art in their teaching.
I'm very glad to hear it.
So, thank you very much for these presentations and discussions. And
thank you.
You filled the time with